Hey everybody, welcome back to the Never Stop Building YouTube channel. I am Jason, and today we have a very interesting lecture from a good friend of mine, Jim Blauvelt. This happened at the 2023 Maine Japanese Woodworking Festival. We're going to be having one 2024, and this is a good example of some of the teaching that happens during that festival. So Jim has been doing woodworking and Japanese woodworking his entire career. He apprenticed under Toshihiro Sahara and Makoto Imai, and he's also an accomplished blacksmith and knife maker. So he's got a really unique combination of experience that informs this discussion of setting up the Japanese plane and the metallurgy and what's going on with the blade, the chipbreaker, the die. It's very fascinating. I learned a lot watching it and editing it together. So without further ado, here's Jim.
I suppose I'll start off by kind of qualifying that this goes completely against my nature to be in front of a huge crowd of people. So you're all naked playing the tuba right now. It's kind of horrifying.
I accept.
Bear with me. Suppose I'll start with a story. My daughter comes to me with her iPad and stuffs it in front of my face in the shop, and it's this dog. She goes, "We got to get this guy," and I'm like, "Yeah, let's get him." So I get this dog, and we kind of bonded really quickly, and so this dog hangs out with me all the time, and I take him everywhere, and he's in my truck. And so one day we go down to my neighbor who's a farmer, and he produces eggs for the pharmaceutical industry, and he wanted me to super tune his sawmill in trade for eggs, and I'm all about that. So we go down, I take my dog down to this farm, and he's smelling all the smells that he had when he was a puppy, so he's doing zoomies in this guy's chicken coop, running back and forth. And me and the farmer are in the cooler, and in the cooler he's got these towers of egg flats, and they're standing up about 6 feet tall. You know, they're 36 eggs to a flat, and they're high. And so this dog, he's half Pyrenees and half petty criminal, comes running in, and he bumps one of those towers, and it freaking leans over like this, and then it snaps back. Cylindrical objects bound in a matrix can slip and flex back, and that's what steel is. It's iron with 1% or maybe a tiny bit more of carbon locked in a matrix that makes iron steel. So this bar right here is basically a piece of simple tool steel, very similar to Hitachi white steel, that's been heat treated as I would heat treat any cutting tool. And this is its nature. It'll bend and flex back straight. Now, what does that mean to a woodworker? Particularly in planing. Steel is incredibly flexible. Changing drain direction in wood will cause an edge to move. Having that edge move is what causes torn grain. So now the things that you need to do to eliminate that desire for the wood to pull the edge into the material, causing actually the cut to vary in thickness, because that edge is flexing and pulling in is what causes tear out. The Japanese design of a plane, they've really worked out and given the end user the ability to address all those issues and eliminate them to the point where you can plane wood without tear out. You know, many people ask, you know, and even yesterday, you know, around the circle where we were sitting, the question was, well, what is exactly the difference between a Western plane and a Japanese plane? And although there are a lot of differences, if you boil it all down, it is Japanese planes address the issue of the material wanting to flex the edge, causing it to pull down and tear the material. Sharpening goes a long way into alleviating that thing, but it doesn't take it the whole way. The blade fit into the body is another factor. If there is any movement in the blade and the body, you're planing along, the material will want to pull the blade down. All those inaccuracies will show up as tear out. You know, so if your blade is tearing out, sharpness is the one thing to check. Blade fit is another thing to check. Sharpness is a thing to check. Sole condition is a thing to check. Alleviating all of the things that would make, let's say, a plane shaving come out as a different thickness. And we've all experienced it. You're planing along, hit a tank or a spot. It slows down, it's harder to pull, the shaving gets thicker, and the grain tears. Kind of at Kezerokai, we're really spoiled, and you know, Jude has scoured the whole Pacific Northwest for the 10 best pieces of Port Orford cedar to plane. And the real world as a carpenter, that always isn't possible. So, and planing figured hardwood, a lot of people say, oh, Japanese planes don't work well in domestic hardwood, and that's absolutely not true. Everything about a Japanese plane can address the difficulties in planing hardwood, figured hardwood, and you can alleviate them. So that's, you know, kind of what I want to stress with people is, one, you know, how much the edge actually moves. And now this is a fairly thick piece of material. It's 1/8 of an inch thick. But I'm not putting a whole lot of pressure on it to get that edge to move. If you think about how thin your sharpened edge is and how much that can actually move. And I'd like to show that visually, if you can actually see it. See the wrinkle? It's actually quite large.
What's wrinkling?
The edge.
All right, go ahead and add pressure.
Oh, yeah.
See it?
Yeah.
And it flexes back. See it?
Wait. I'm trying.
This technique is actually used by knife makers as a way to visually inspect the thickness of an edge, because that wrinkle will actually get larger and smaller depending upon how thick or thin it is. But it's also a good way to show how, I'm barely putting any pressure on that.
So that's literally the ductility
Exactly.
of the tool at the edge where it's skinniest.
So now if
it's not clear what we're seeing, you're seeing a wave as he puts pressure down on the edge of the blade on the dowel. You're seeing a wave ride all the way down as he moves the knife. And I'm hoping that's what you're seeing.
And if anyone is actually interested in seeing that, come find me and I'll show you. It's a really eye-opening thing. It was for me when I first saw literally how flexible a sharp edge is. It kind of blew my mind. And that leads me to the next discussion about exactly what a sub blade does. All right, so the edge, a thin edge, a sharpened edge is a very flexible thing, and at Kez, and we're planing this gorgeous material, a subblade isn't really necessary. Those materials don't provide the forces that figured wood does to make the edge flex. As the blade gets duller, perhaps yes, but usually on a freshly sharpened tool, you can get outstanding results with gorgeous material and not have a subblade. And not using a subblade, in fact, produces a shinier surface. So there's that. A lot of my hand planing is done with planes that have no subblade. But I want to talk about what the actual function of a subblade is. And what it is not is a chip breaker. It has nothing to do with breaking a chip. What it does do is it pre-tensions the edge of the steel by taking some of that flex out of it. So by using a subblade in a blade that fits the block super well, that's conditioned well, can plane figured wood very easily. And that's what the subblade does. Now on a Japanese subblade, the way that you sharpen it, is important. The two surfaces need to mate perfectly, so that when you put them together, they don't rock. So they can be adjusted by tapping on the ears of the subblade, and you can get it so that the land makes perfect contact, no daylight coming through. They're both two perfectly flat surfaces, honed and coming together. The ears are bent in such a way that they both are making contact with the main blade, so there's no rocking. We hone a micro bevel on the subblade, and what that does is makes its edge stiffer than the cutting edge. And by having that happen, you're basically able to preload this. And that's, it's a really important thing when planing figured wood, that those things all be addressed. The other thing that needs to be addressed is exactly how tight that is, and how tight you make your subblade depends on what it is you're planing. The Western approach to planing figured hardwood has always been to raise the cutting angle. There are a lot of people, I hear it all the time on forums, is that I'm having trouble with planing this stick of cherry, it's tearing out like crazy. Should I be using a plane that's at 42 degrees instead of 38? And my answer is absolutely not. There's something else that needs to be addressed with either your blade fit, your sharpening, your subblade fit, or your sole condition. And if you get all those things dialed in, you don't need a 42 degree plane. And those things are hard to pull. I don't know if you've ever tried to pull a high angle plane, but it's awful. And if you have to do that for days on end, it's really awful. So a standard 8-10 pitch blade that's set up correctly can take shavings in figured hardwood without tearing out. So how do you know that you've got all that stuff dialed in? If all that stuff is dialed in correctly, theoretically you should be able to pull a shaving with the grain or against the grain and it be the same thickness. And that's a way to test how well you've set up your plane. If you plane something against the grain and the shaving becomes thicker, that stress is actually going beyond what the subblade is supposed to do and allowing more wood. It's pulling that blade down more. So you want to preload any flex in the cutting edge. And so if you take set up your plane and take a pass with the grain and you get this beautiful ribbon and you spin it around and you get tear out, there's something that needs to be addressed in it. And it's usually, the first thing is blade fit in the die. It needs to be supported really well, and it needs to be supported really well down low. When I fit a blade to a block, I have 100% contact down low. And then my pattern where it touches is an arc. And the reason why I make it an arc is I want lateral adjustment. But it's really important that it go down low. One of the questions that comes up quite a bit is, what is the domestic wood comparable to Japanese white oak that can be used for planes? And you can make a plane out of anything, but Japanese oak, by nature of the tangential rays and their strength, do so much to support movement of the blade and the body while it's under pressure. I visited the School of the American Craftsman when I was really, really early on in my woodworking career. And the first year students probably spent a solid month doing nothing but honing with lapping compound the connection between the frog and the sole of a metal plane. Sitting there, and that the movement, they literally had maybe a 1/16 of an inch of play, and they would just sit there and lap and lap and lap until those two surfaces met so well they eliminated the movement. And that's what the rays and white oak do. They totally support. They lean behind the blade, usually in a vertical position, and act as like rebar and support the blade and eliminate its wanting to move. If you pick a domestic hardwood that doesn't have rays, there will be flex in between the blade and the body. So my answer to the question of what material can I use besides Japanese oak is, use whatever you want. And when it tears out, buy a piece of oak, buy a piece of Japanese white oak. The ray pattern in dye is interesting. I like it when the tangential rays in a block are almost perpendicular. Almost a perfectly, as an English term, flat sawn. Oddly enough, Japanese plain block makers, when they talk about this particular pattern, they call it vertical grain. They call it quarter sawn, because what they're talking about is the rays and not the annual rings. So that confuses some people, particularly when you're trying to talk to a Japanese guy, not speaking Japanese very well, and he's calling it masame, and it's not. It's flat sawn. It's not quarter sawn. So there's that.
The rays are masame.
Now, a lot of carpenters want this pattern to show an X, where it's rift cut, where the rays are going this way at a 45-degree angle, and the annual rings are going that way at a 45-degree angle. And although the flat sawn cut that I love is really predictable in its movement. Like, I know when it goes out, and it does go out. They go out with just small humidity changes, and you need to address how it twists or cups. When it's an X, it usually goes out of condition in an uneven manner. However, if the pattern of annual rings and medullary rays do make an X, what you end up with is a stronger die, because you hit it here an awful lot. And rays that are perfectly vertical, anyone who has split firewood knows that's where you want to hit it. You want to hit it going parallel with the raise, your axe, and it'll split easily. So generally speaking, this pattern, the pattern that I like because it moves predictably, also has the potential of over a period of years cracking here because I've been whacking it there so much. So I kind of trade off the strength of having that pattern create an X to liking the predictability of how it moves, and I'm just careful about how I take the blade in and out. So then, so when you're thinking about what makes a good die, what makes a die that will plain figured hardwood without tearing out, it's a lot of raise. The more, if you look at you go to the store and you're going to buy a block and you have 10 to pick from, I look at the raise and I find the one that's got the most raise in it. White oak is such a resilient wood. It's so, it holds a blade so well because of its flexibility, because of the nature of how those rays are stitched in there and woven in there. So the more of them, the better, I find.
So Jim, when you talk about the raise as opposed to the grain, you're looking, the grain itself could be fairly broad, but the rays want to be really tight.
Really tight, right, really tight. And I generally look for, I bought some, a lot of times, being a woodworker, using Japanese hand tools in America, you need to buy stuff sight unseen. And I found a couple of really good distributors, Andrew being one of them, that sells exceptional quality white oak blocks. And so I'm confident that if I call Andrew up for a die and tell him I want, rays that are perpendicular to the face, I'm gonna get that.
Yeah.
So, but it's also cool, I've actually had opportunity to see, I visited a die maker in Japan in Niigata, Inomoto-san, and you walk into his house, it's actually his shop. He's got 250,000 blocks piled up everywhere. You can barely walk from one end of a room to another without having to walk around, a stack of just gorgeous, gorgeous material. The guy's got a small fortune in white oak dye that has been drying his whole career. It's phenomenal. And to be able to walk through and pick the one you want is a wonderful thing. But if you're looking at buying a tool and there's 4 of them on the shelf, you can pretty much look and decide, okay, this one has the ray pattern I want. This one has a really tight medullary ray pattern that's, making a perfect X. Then that's the one you buy. So what's the difference between a good one and a bad one? And how do you know? Well, the ray pattern, how many rays are there, how tight it is. The other thing that you can do is tap it. And a really good Japanese die will have a really high pitch. If you hit something soft, hear the difference? So that ring, that really high ring, kind of tells you that it's going to hold a blade really well. I was out helping a guy with his plane, and it was a store-bought plane. I haven't actually used a plane that I didn't make the die for in a number of years because of inaccuracies that are in something that someone else made. So I cut all my own blocks, and to have that control is important to me. And I sharpened his plane, I set up the sole, and I tried to take a shaving in this maple, and it would not cut it. It would not cut it. It tore the shit out of it. And it's a blade to block fit issue, which can be addressed if you make your own. I can get more accurate than someone who's knocking out a bunch of them in a day. And Japanese plane block makers don't generally fit a blade
Full, no.
fully, so there's that. So the one of the things that I really wanted to come across and get through to people today is the actual flexibility of the edge, and what is it that causes tear out, and what are the things that you do to a plane to address that. And I think I've kind of touched on that with the whole sub-blade, pre-tensioning an edge, why we put a micro bevel on it, and what that function is. The blade to block fit. I haven't really touched on conditioning the sole. It's really important, no twist. There is a wave pattern where, there's contact points here and here, but it's not only that. If it were only that, we could literally take a router and chunk out a huge mass of material in here and still get good results, but that doesn't work. So what actually happens? What actually happens is, as you're cutting wood, it's flexing. If you've ever thought why shavings curl up as you pull them, or why sometimes you take a shaving and the shaving shoots out of the plane and makes an arc. The material is resilient, it moves before it can be cut. You're applying pressure to wood, and it actually gives a little bit before you cut it. So you're actually cutting faster on the top than the bottom, is what I'm getting at. It's like a pair of scissors across a ribbon, and you can expand one side of the ribbon while the other side stays the same. And that does a lot for helping relieve tear out. Because basically what you're doing is pre-compressing the fibers prior to them being cut. And that's what a really well-conditioned plane will do. It will support the material to accept the blade. And there's a huge difference between a blade that's not conditioned well to one that is. Usually mornings are humid, afternoons are not. 9 times out of 10, I'm conditioning my sole in the morning before I use it. By noon, water has left the end grain. This shrinks, and you get this half moon. I don't know if you can see it. That means my throat opening is actually that wide. If you've ever picked up a Western plane off the shelf, and I don't really care what brand it is, I'm not here to dog any Western tool maker, and put a straight edge on it, it's nowhere near flat. It's nowhere near close to being able to do what woodworkers want it to do. And by having a wooden soled plane, we can address those issues, where a metal plane, those issues can be addressed, but it's going to involve a lapping plate and carborundum powder and lapping compound and months of sitting there honing a frog. Not a lot of fun, but with Japanese planes, all those things can be addressed. The other thing too that's really kind of interesting to me is I was given a toolbox full of tools by a retired boat carpenter, and they were his apprentice tools, and all his planes were wood, and they all had a lower angle than a standard metal Western plane. So in the development of Western planes, they increased the cutting angle so that any schmo could pick up a plane and get mediocre results. So there's that end of it.
Jim, just
Yeah.
a question on tear outs.
Sure.
is it fair to say that just in general, tear out is a function of blade deflection, and the reason why Japanese planes are superior to Western is because the manner, well, this is the question, is it because it's due to the manner in which it's affixed in the block, or is it because the wooden block itself is more rigid?
It could be any number of those fundamental things. Sharpness, subblade to main blade fit, main blade to body fit, sole conditioning. Your bench doing this will cause tear out. You know, all of those factors, and the fact that they can be addressed in a wooden plane, in my mind, is what makes them better. You know, that is in effect, in my mind, what makes them better, is that I, as a carpenter, can address the issues and get good results. Now, in the very beginning of me, I was a professional woodworker before I used Japanese tools. And Japanese tools, you know, to a swamp Yankee like me, wasn't an easy sell. And it was a salesman that was trying to get me to buy Japanese woodworking tools. And I'm like, no, man, I'm good. I got all the planes I need, you know. But he walked into the back of his shop and he grabbed a plane that he had probably spent all morning setting up. I didn't see this. He pulled it out of the box, pulled this awesome shaving, and I was like, I'd never seen anything like it. It was amazing to me. And I didn't realize it was going to take a freaking lifetime to, you know, to kind of figure out how to do that. So, but, you know, the journey is enjoyable, you know. And I've literally planed houses worth of wood. And the houses that I've planed aren't always old growth, Port Orford cedar, vertical grain, common grain direction. You know, some of the beams that I've planed were number 2 Doug fir with knots. You plane that. You know, I had a furniture maker who made just gorgeous furniture in figured wood. Asked me, you know, if I could plane curly maple, and I was like, curly maple's not that hard to plane. And he was like, well, what would you consider something hard to plane? And I said, plane the inside face of a flat sawn piece of western red cedar with knots. If you can plane that without tear out, then you've got some chops. So it's kind of all relative. Sometimes as a carpenter we get substandard material. Sometimes when I, you know, if the client is supportive of old growth Alaskan yellow cedar, I'm buying it. You know, I love working with really good material, but it isn't always possible. You know, as a demonstration, this is a fairly gnarly piece of curly maple. I don't know if anyone can see, you know, how curled out this stick is. You know, so the ones who say Japanese woodworking tools are no good in in domestic American hardwood, I say you're wrong.
And you are correct.
And then, how do you know it's set up correctly? Can we plane this nasty stick against the grain? No tear out. And this was a brand new plane yesterday. I just set it up. Fits really well in the block. Subblade and main blade mate perfectly. I've got the sub blade tight enough that it's deflecting the edge. It's sharp. There's no twist. It's conditioned so that there's 2 contact points. And there's no fear of me tearing out this piece of really gnarly curly maple.
And it makes that great sound.
Yeah, yeah. And we're that much closer to pow flop.
Yeah. Jim go boom.
This will be a American long rifle.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When you talked about the preconditioned pressure on the wood, what surface of the plane is pressuring that wood before the cut?
The mouth, the throat, the mouth.
Okay.
There are times, particularly with really, really soft woods, like I don't know if any of you have ever used Paulownia or Catalpa or some pines.
Yeah, it's Eastern White.
I won't just have 2 contact points. I will make a ramp from there to there so that there's actually, as that wood flexes, it gets pulled up into the die and there's more contact. Like I'll plane wood and it'll be shiny from burnishing that big. You know, and it moves quite a bit. It moves quite a bit. So if you think about it, if you have just a tiny stripe right there, then that's the only area that you're burnishing. But by making a ramp, as the board flexes up and the die flexes down, there's touch pattern here. You can see where it's rubbed. And a lot of times that's a good thing. And then you can also, by seeing the shine, if you look up towards the light, you can see where the die is out of condition. Oh, it's shinier over here than here, so it's hitting here. It's a little twisted, it's hitting over here. So, and then you can address that. And then the actual, you know, one of the things that's kind of probably a not such a good sales thing for Japanese tools is actually how much conditioning needs to happen in the course of a day. You know, those 2 things are so married together and they can never be separated. You know, there's you know, my winding sticks and my straight edge and my scraper plane are never far away from my planing bench. You know, if I have a whole house full of ceiling boards to plane, I'm not using one plane. I have a number of them ready to go and use them in a series. And that's how you become an efficient hand planer. It's not because I can get this thing so sharp and so well conditioned that it lasts all day. As soon as a plane starts to drop off, I set it aside and grab another one. And then I'll use the first one as the medium plane and take mill marks off with the medium plane, and then use the really sharp plane for the last pass. And then this one starts to get dull. And this one is now really dull. So I set it aside and I have another one to grab. And that's the only way to be efficient about planing a whole house full of parts. And believe me, the Japanese plane a whole house full of parts. You know, there's people are using super surfacers now. But the company that I worked for in Japan, anything that could be touched with your hand, the super surfacer wasn't good enough. It had to be hand planed. So, you know, door parts, door jambs, anything that was below touch level needed to be hand planed, because you can feel the difference. You can certainly totally feel the difference between a super surfacer that's set up really, really well. Would you agree with that, Brian? Yeah. You can tell the difference. And the other thing that's really nice about the super surfacer, it is the quintessential middle plane, because it'll remove mill marks like nothing. And then you just one tiny kiss with a really fine setup hand plane, and it's done. And to actually see, you know, a whole house of hand plane material it's an experience. The amount of wood or the amount of work involved is staggering. And there's literally a whole trade set up of guys that do nothing but plane, Like there are carpenters that'll bring frame parts to the plane guy, and he does nothing but this all day. Really good plane. Did that answer your question?
Perfectly, yeah.
Wonderful. Any other questions?
You were talking about white oak as a guide, but that's specifically Japanese white oak.
Yeah, Japanese white oak is a different genus than our domestic white oak, and the problem with our domestic white oak is it's too ring porous. American live oak is a more closely related material to Japanese white oak. Not exactly the same genus, but close. They're both evergreens. They both don't have ring pores, and they're both full of broad rays, broad tangential rays. I've actually made a couple of die out of live oak, but the problem with live oak in the States is that it's not produced by sawyers. It's usually given to me by someone who took it out of their firewood pile. So it's not really, dried well or treated very well. Most of the time it cracks before you can make anything out of it. So the Japanese white oak, there's a whole industry around preparing that lumber for die makers to make planes. That's why Mr. Inomoto has 250,000 blocks ready to go, and in various stages of drying, and then not consider using it for 10 years. Literally, dried for 10 years. And there's no industry like that here in the States. I think at one point in Europe, they did that with hornbeam, and they did that with beech. But that industry in the States is dead. You can buy beech, and if you look at it, it's got all the right stuff. The ray pattern is similar to Japanese white oak. The annual ring pattern is similar to Japanese white oak, but if you tap it, white oak will ring and beech will sound dead. Somebody's got to hit me with questions. Does anybody want to see exactly how close a sub blade should be to a main blade in order for it to be effective? I'm going to pass this around. The short blade is a model of a sub blade. The main blade is the long one. And if you want to know exactly how close that guy should be in order for it to do its job and pre-tension the edge, this is how close it needs to be. My hope in making this model was that I could make this and put a clamp on it and visually with a straight edge put it on there, and you'll be able to see that tension put in there. But it's too small for my eyes. But I know it's happening, but it's just too small for my eyes. But if you want to see how close,
Yes.
I'm gonna pass it around.
You were talking earlier about
Any closer and it would be doing the cutting. That's my point. When you're setting up the main blade, any further out and it would cut. That's where you want it.
not to keep
Go ahead.
talking on the angle conversation, but you mentioned earlier like 8-10 angle.
Ah,
Could you get
yeah, as a carpenter, I mean, I don't even own a protractor. And in Japan, they don't sell planes by degree of angle. They sell planes by pitch. That pitch, rise and run, just like a roof,
Okay.
So 810 is how I was told to lay out and cut a die. 810 pitch. So a Japanese scale is a decimal system. Not only do they use metric, but they use Japanese decimal foot. Very, very broadly, they use shaku. And you know, the square is in tenths. So you
All
set,
base 10, no base 12.
you set that at an 810 and strike the line, and that's the cutting angle, and it turns out that that cutting angle is 38 degrees. So some people will say, make your plane 38 degrees. They take a protractor and they set a T-bevel up. They take a protractor and set the T-bevel up and then strike a 38-degree angle. But in Japan, what they do is they take a sashigane and they hold 10 here and 8 there, and that is the cutting angle.
Like laying out a roof or
Laying out a
stairway.
roof, yeah, or anything with an angle on it. I don't even use a T-bevel anymore. I don't use a protractor anymore. I use this. If I have to do repeatable things, I might set up a fixture.
Yeah, make a better.
But for the most part, I'm using this along with story poles, and I think Jeff touched on story poles a little bit. But I have some higher angle planes, I never use them. You know, another interesting thing to kind of talk about with that 38-degree angle. So here's a block. 38-degree cutting angle. Blade bevel. I can't draw very well. This angle, I never actually measure this. You know, the angle of your bevel, your cutting edge, I never measure that. If it chips, it's too acute. If it doesn't chip, I can make it more acute. And that's the wave I ride.
And more acute is better. If
More
you
acute
get
is
away-
better. You want the blade as acute as it can be without chipping. Chipping is a drag because then it takes a long time to resharpen. I want my blades to get dull, I don't want them to get chipped. So I'm constantly playing with that angle. And after 40 years of sharpening Japanese tools, it is staggering how consistent I'm sharpening at 27 degrees. Because I literally,
Now you've gone back and measured.
I've
for the
measured,
fact
and
that
it's like, oh my God, you know, I just eyeballed that, and it's there. So I know I'm kind of there. The other thing that I want to talk about is this angle here, the angle from your bevel to the back, and that is known as a clearance angle.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't have a straight bevel on your plane, if this becomes round, you lose your clearance angle and it won't take a cut, or it'll be very hard to pull. It'll be really hard to take a shaving, you know, and what the heck is going on? That's because the material is actually hitting back here before it's hitting the edge. So that's one of the reasons why a flat bevel is really important, is you don't want to blow your clearance angle. If you start sharpening round, then you need to have a higher angle cutting plane in order for the material to even hit the edge. Now, Western planes, they have a thing called a low angle plane, and that's kind of a misnomer, because on a Stanley low angle block plane, they flip the blade over and the bevel is on top.
So the included angle is the same.
The included angle is the same. Now, there are some craftsmen in Japan that do nothing but make bureaus for kimono, and they use paulownia or kiri wood, and it's so incredibly soft, and it's so difficult to plane. It just balls up when you plane it. It's really similar to our catalpa. I don't know if anybody's messed with catalpa. It's a really gorgeous wood to look at. Really difficult to work because it's so soft. It's like softer than balsa.
Crushes and crumbles.
Those craftsmen use what appears to be a Stanley low-angle block plane, where they flip the blade over, have it bevel side up, but also lower the angle, so it's really acute. You know, their blade is almost sticking out the back. You know, and then they can slice it. They also their sharpening angle can be way more acute than a standard plane. But that's just
Your die are usually really thin too.
thin, yeah, because of that.
Right.
You know, the thinner it is, you still get a length of support. So that's kind of interesting. So I don't know. I hope all that kind of helped get people's heads wrapped around planing, and you know, we're getting ready to have a shaving competition, and all the things I've touched on, if addressed, will help people's planing, and that's my hope.
Jim, you had also mentioned about tapping out.
Yeah, right.
And the importance of remembering the fact that the body material and the blade material are dissimilar.
Yeah, one of the you know, why are Japanese blades 2-layer blades? And you know, I've talked about this, how steel, when it's heat treated, is incredibly flexible. You can bend it and it'll bend back. By incorporating iron onto the steel, by making it a 2-layer blade, the steel will overcome the iron will overcome the steel's desire to spring back. So 2-layer blades and 3-layer blades become, you're able to manipulate the shape of them by hammering them in a cold state. Meaning, so as a knife maker, if I make a mono-steel blade, meaning a blade that's made out of just steel, no iron, 9 times out of 10 in heat treat it'll develop a warp. Forged blades, a lot of people say forged blades are better than blades that have been ground, and that's a bunch of hooey. Because forging a blade introduces so much stress into the material that you know, it becomes cantankerous, and you know, go through the heat treating process and make a knife, and you pull it out of the quench tank and it's bent. And it's those stresses from forging that are being released during the quench. With a Japanese blade, it being 2 pieces or 3 pieces, most Japanese knives are 3-layer. You know, some form of iron or mild steel on each side of carbon steel, like a sandwich. And those blades are totally workable when they develop a bend, because you can bend them back. You know, iron and mild steel being malleable, but they don't spring back like steel. Like if I took a piece of iron and bent it like that, it would stay bent, it wouldn't spring back. So, you know, Japanese blades are 2-layer so that you can manipulate the shape of the steel, and that's all tapping out is. Tapping out is kind of not a good term to use. We have a term in English called planishing. And if you've seen, you know, Rosie the Riveter back in the 40s making Studebakers, you know, they had a hammer and an anvil, and they would shape curves in metal. And that's what we're doing when we tap out. We're using a hammer to hit the iron, causing it to expand, which bends this. And then we flatten it out, and that's what creates the ura.
But it's being held in that
It's
state.
being held by the iron. Now over time, as you hone it, those tensions are relaxed, and you need to tap out again. You know, so tapping out is just a part of maintenance, and they have built that ability to maintain shape by making it a 2-layer blade or a 3-layer blade. one of the things that I really want to dispel around Japanese blades and blade making in general is one that forged blades are automatically better than non-forged blades. They may be better, and that's because so much needs to go into heat treating of a blade in order to remove the stresses that you put into it by beating it with a hammer, that it may become a better blade because it's been properly heat treated, properly normalized and annealed. And then the other thing I want to talk about and kind of get across is what the tap out hammer should look like. It's been written, and I've also heard it a bunch of times where guys will use a saw set hammer to tap out a blade because a saw set hammer has teeth on it. And what ends up happening is that as you're tapping out a Japanese blade, if you make a mishit, you can crack it. What the teeth in a saw set hammer do is mask your mishits. So what a tapping out hammer or a planishing hammer looks like is it's a cross beam. It's very dull, and it has the ability to dent the iron. By denting that iron, it puts stress on the main steel, causing it to bend, and that bend allows you to hone it off and make the land, rejuvenate the land. As you sharpen it, that land disappears. So you hit it again on the anvil, and by hitting it, that iron expands, forcing the hard steel to bend. If you see planes that have when it's new, the land is beautiful. It comes from almost nothing, and it makes this beautiful arc right here, and comes across, and you have a year's worth of sharpening right there, and then it makes another nice arc, and it comes down to almost nothing. And after me working with the thing for a year, it ends up looking like this. Where I haven't actually done any tapping out. I've just flattened it. And by just flattening it, now it doesn't fit in the block anymore. So by doing too much flattening, you blow the fit in the block.
You changed it. You changed the taper of the
You
blade.
change the taper of the blade.
Right at
And
the
the
top
thickness of
and
it.
the
Right,
front.
right, and having the front loose is the worst thing that you could possibly have if you want to plane stuff like this. So tapping out is a real almost required skill,
Most definitely.
and a lot of people are really afraid of it, to tap out, but it's really kind of interesting. A lot of the hot shop planers, guys that do nothing but plane in Japan, when they tap out, they leave this really, really tiny band here. And my bro Andrew loves this really, really small, almost non-existent land. And that's achieved by hitting it way too close up top here.
Yeah, scary.
It's scary. So there's the bevel. I didn't draw ears. There's your bevel. And he hits it way up here where there's no iron. There's no iron to help push this. So you need, when you tap out, you need to hit back here. You need to hit on the heel. And that's what expands the iron, planishes the iron. Those forces bend the steel forward, and then you flatten it again, and you end up with this really pretty band here. But that small land thing, I don't know if you've ever heard that with Japanese carpenters before, but they say that guy needs to be really, really tiny, and it's like, I don't want to have to tap it out again next week, you know? I want to get a month out of it at least. So, and I'll do tap out demonstrations for anybody that wants to see it. If anyone's got a crooked blade they want adjusted, you know, find me out there. I'd be happy to give a personal tap out demonstration. It's kind of too, you know, rough to do in a crowd this big, particularly while you're all playing the tuba. So, any more questions?
Quick question
Yeah.
around the balance of the tension with the sub blade, and like it's I'm trying to stack through like a sequence of events here, right? So one is getting the land right, the fit right with the die, so that the front edge of the blade is as stiff as possible, rigid as possible.
Right.
And then
There's
a slight bevel, or
there's
you
a
said
really
slight-
clear way to determine how well the blade fits in the block. So the first thing is, how well does the blade fit in the block? So as I tap this in, listen to the sound. And it reaches that highest pitch and stays there. That's as tight as you'll ever want it. You don't want to go make it tight past that high pitch sound. So if you tap it in and that pitch stops rising, and you look at it and it's almost there, you're good. If the pitch is still rising and it's protruding, it's too loose. If the pitch stops rising and you still have a 1/16 of an inch to go, it's too tight. So you got to take a little more out. So by listening to the die, that will tell you how tight you can be. So you want to be at the point where the pitch stops rising. Now with the sub blade, it's a little bit different. And I've touched on it. How do you know when the sub blade is tight enough?
Right.
It will take figured wood, same thickness shaving, going with the grain or against the grain. And that's when it's tight enough.
In terms of how to set it,
And how
So you
when you're
get there?
setting it up.
there's a multitude of ways to be able to see that. One of them is to overgrind the ears on your iron, so you can actually see the corners of the sub blade from the bottom of the plane.
Oh, when to stop pushing it forward, right.
Is that
I think you were talking about
Well,
the tightness of it.
I'm trying to figure out how to do it, and and is there such thing as even a too tight? Because like if
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Oh,
too
yeah.
tight
the
and
blade
it'll crack.
itself,
Yeah.
the blade itself has to be pre-tension. There's a place where it's like, okay, it's just now pressure applied to the whole blade and kind of
Right.
bending it versus like flexing
No,
it, right?
the thing that will tell you that is it in fact taking the same thickness shaving, going with the grain or against the grain.
I see.
Now there are woods that just can't be planed.
What?
Period.
What?
You know,
Come
there
on,
are
man.
plain
Well-
Ipe. You plain
Not for
Ipe.
Matt,
I do it.
but for everybody else.
Everybody else.
Except Matt.
Yeah. No, there's some tropical woods that are just, you know, a monster to plane.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't want to plane Bubinga.
Black palm.
Yeah, stuff like that is nuts.
Dust. Yeah.
But you know, standard domestic hardwoods that we trip over on a day-to-day basis are totally planeable.
Even the most
You know.
brash stuff too.
Yeah,
Wild ass white oak grain that's rising and falling and twisted. You can do it.
Yeah, or you know, western red cedar with knots
Yeah, which is hard. Or fir.
or fir. Right. Questions?
Yeah, so 15 more minutes.
How influential is the angle and the die in front of the blade? I know it varies between, like, if you have a single blade
At the
versus
mouth,
a double
yeah.
blade, but like the angle that forms the mouth with the sole.
I asked that question to a die maker, and I'll stand by his answer. Because I actually don't know the answer to that question, other than it is this much. This is what he uses to lay out. That is how much it's forward. So this line is struck. I don't even think I have a pencil. This line is struck from the actual throat opening. I should lay one out. Because I see this, and to me, when I see one that's too far forward, my butt puckers up. It's like, what are you thinking? You know, why that? You know.
Quite a response.
And when it's, you know, when it's not, you know, too far forward, it has the same effect on me. You know, it throws me emotionally off balance. But if this is where that you want the throat opening sticking out, right there, seriously?
Jay, is that the angle you're asking, or the other angle further down?
He's asking the front one.
Yeah, like the angle, like where the blade meets
Oh,
the
so
sole.
it's a direct
this
ratio
interior
of the width
angle,
of the
how
Sashigami.
It
influential
is.
that?
Oh, that one, because he's showing you a different angle.
Well,
There's
it's-
there's
both
the
those
cutting
kind of
angle.
Intersection of those two angles of the
Yeah.
yeah.
So there's the cutting angle. That's the cutting angle. That is a plumb line from the mouth opening up. This mortise, I lay out the thickness of a sashigami. It's not even a number, it's just this.
But then, what about the relation of the chipbreaker bevel to the throat on the reverse angle?
I usually draw that.
Okay. So
And
then-
literally, it's a matter of taking the sub blade and, you know, putting it on there.
Yeah,
And, you know, some of, you know, like, you know, guys that are cutting plane blades, you know, making blocks, and they're using jigs and fixtures for their chisel, and I don't do any of that.
No.
You know, if I freaking used a jig to chop a mortise, I'd get smacked. You know, you don't have time for that.
I cheat. I drill them. I waste them with a drill.
Yeah, so it's that is what Inomoto-san used.
Mhm.
He used this number as that, how far forward. Was it your plane I was looking at last night going, man, that freaking thing is way up here?
No, I don't think so.
No, somebody else, someone's got one that's,
Sure. I'm not responsible for your butthole fuckery.
you know, like, you know, but when you think about it, really the only thing holding this plane together is these two strips. And the more material you remove out of here, the, you know, the kind of the weaker that's gonna be. So I think, you know, 5. Now, there's times when, you know, let's say a shaving is jamming up. Then I would address that. You know, if I needed to remove some wood there for shaving clearance. But generally, it's not important. You know, and Mr. Inomoto, if you watched him lay out a die and chop it, he might draw 3 lines and literally make the plane. But he's made, you know, 100,000 of them. So. Is that effective in what I wanted it to do, to show how close? That question actually comes up a lot. And most people don't set them in far enough, so it's really not doing anything. Questions?
I missed some of the beginning, so if you've covered that, just let me know.
No, I'll repeat it because I have like 12 minutes left and I'm dying up here.
We don't need to
Ask
use-
away.
We don't need to use up all the time.
Ask away.
Thoughts on Chipbreaker versus no Chipbreaker? Single blade or blade
No,
with Chipbreaker?
I touched on it, single blade planes, and this probably be a good time to talk more about alloy steel. No Chipbreaker is a shinier surface. No Chipbreaker is actually easier to pull.
But easier strength-wise? or
Strength-wise.
Easier to get a nice surface?
Perhaps both. Perhaps both. In my opinion, I love using no Chipbreaker. Probably 80% of my planes, and I got a lot of planes, I don't use a Chipbreaker. I have yet to make a plane blade with a Chipbreaker, because I don't generally need one. Figured hardwood, you need one. I would not want to plane this with my blade with no chip breaker. I know it'll just rip it to shreds.
And isn't the Chipbreaker a fairly recent thing in Japanese playing?
Fairly recent is
300 years?
yeah, that's a relative. Now, when you start getting into, all right, so everything I've touched on so far is basically based on simple carbon steel. Some of the best work in history has been built using just simple carbon steel, pre-alloyed steel. Oddly enough, steel manufacturers are not making steel for woodworkers. They are making steel for the industry. They're making steel for car springs or industrial machinery. And the engineering of steel has developed so that they can add alloys to steel to reduce weight, to reduce spring. Because there are times when you're building a train and you don't want the steel to do this. Well, what do you think super blue does? Super blue steel, Japanese super blue steel, was not developed for woodworking. It was developed for industry. And they wanted a material that had the same grain structure but wouldn't flex as much. So why, a lot of people wonder about, should I buy white steel chisels? Should I buy blue steel chisels? First of all, if your sharpening isn't on the level of Andrew Wren, you're probably not going to know the difference between blue and white steel. Andrew can tell you the taste of it.
Vintage wine.
Right. But you've got to be at a seriously high level to even notice. And a funny personal experience around the whole white steel, blue steel collection. I had a plane blade that I bought early on in my apprenticeship, and I absolutely loved it. And it was sold to me as Japanese white #1. And it was my go-to. If I had a stick that I knew was going to be really difficult to plane, that was the plane I was going to grab. I was going to be able to sharpen it effectively, and it would make a beautiful surface. It was my marriage plane. It was the one I would grab. It was a Usui, beautiful plane. As I started getting more and more into Japanese woodworking, and I started to be able to read kanji a little bit and understand a little bit of the Japanese language, I read the plane, and the plane said blue steel #2. and for 10 years, I'd been dogging blue steel #2. But in my own sensibility, my own intuition said, this is a really good plane. And there's so many other factors involved that what alloy in it doesn't really matter to me. The best work in history was done with simple tool steel. Tamahagane is junk when you first, when it's in a crucible state. And it's all the stuff that the blacksmith does to it that make it a good steel. And then nowadays, it's really the alloy steel that's available to tool makers is totally industry driven. And Hitachi has a total lock on their steel. They will not export it. They will not sell it to Americans because they have that whole middleman system. And if somehow if a steel manufacturer elbowed out a middleman, then the whole industry would collapse. And I've heard people say, yeah, I talked to Hitachi, they said they'd sell me steel. And they want me to buy $15,000 worth of it, and they'll sell it to me if I buy that much. Well, I tried to put together a group of people to buy what they said they would sell me, and it just fizzled. And I've talked to other knife makers who said the same thing. And then I've recently read in a technical book, a book on steel, that chemically, our W1 tool steel is chemically interchangeable with white steel #1. the chemicals in it are so close that if you were expected drawing from an engineer, you could swap those two materials and not get in any trouble. They're so identical. But the cost difference, because they will not export it, is what stops me, you know. There's a German guy that somehow got a bunch of Hitachi steel, and he sells it. And he's like the only one other than in Japan that will sell it. And the price is ridiculous. It, the fact that it's so comparable to something I could pay $6 for. So I don't really, I encourage people to, rather than worry about, blue steel or white steel, is worry more about your sharpening, because they're both very effective.
And would you go to favor a maker before a steel type when choosing a plane?
Yes, I would, because that's where the magic is. If there's any alchemy left in blade making, it is the maker. But what he addresses is all the same. The heat treating is a science. It's not an art. There's a recipe followed. And if you follow that recipe, you will get results. Now, one of the mind-blowing things to me about being a tool maker and a carpenter is how consistent Japanese blade makers can be using a coal forge and judging temperature by eye and knowing how to actually heat treat without the aid of measurement. The way I work is not Japanese. The way I forge is not remotely Japanese. I know exactly how hot my furnace is. I have a timer.
Don't modern makers in Japan utilize technology to help out?
And oddly enough, my favorite plain blade maker is Usui. And I don't know why, but one of my favorite photos in craft is this little Japanese guy covered in soot. He's got a hand like he'd been swinging a 5-pound sledgehammer his whole life. Hands covered in soot, adjusting an electron microscope to look at the structure of the steel.
Right.
And he was pulled out of school when he was in junior high school to apprentice to a blade maker. And he received an honorary doctorate degree from Tokyo University as a metallurgist because his stuff is that good. And he went beyond his teacher in that he incorporated an electron microscope and he put a thermocouple in his forge so he knew exactly what the temperature was. And he played with other steel. He made blades out of Swedish steel and German steel. And maybe that's why I love his blades, is because he kind of broke away from, I can't imagine being able to look at a fire and know the temperature. It's mind-blowing to me,
I'm colorblind, I can't do it.
It's so cool to watch steel transform and go from something that's one material and turn into another material. And the first time I actually saw the transformation of steel going from austenite to cementite, watching that conversion where carbon is literally moving in the blade. Because that's what, what steel kind of does. One of the things that I was talking about when my dog hit that carton of eggs and it bent. There's only 1% at, maybe 1.3 would be high of carbon in iron that makes it steel. and it totally transforms the material into something completely different. And you know, it's just it's amazing to me to watch a shadow of black fan out over something red hot and know that carbon is, this thing is alive, it's moving, there's carbon moving.
Attaching itself.
And you know, so what actually makes it hard? What actually makes that structure in a matrix? You know, it's iron particles bound in a matrix, and every so often there's a chunk of carbon stuck in there. And when you take it to a certain temperature, those carbon molecules will jump around and try to find a better spot to fit. And you can visually see that. That blade hits 1475 degrees, and you can watch a black shadow fan across the blade back and forth. You pull it out of the fire, and it's like, holy crap! You see the sine wave pulsing through the red hot steel, and know that carbon is moving around. It's trying to find a better spot to fit within all these iron particles, and then you trap it. You quench it in water, and they get locked in. And a lot of those carbon molecules are stuck in a spot they don't want to be. They don't want it. They don't fit there, and that's what puts the stresses in that cause this. That's what causes the stress. Now, you know, usually when you initially quench, it's totally unusable as a tool. It's way too hard. You can't sharpen it. It's brittle. So then you need to tame it down, and you need to heat it back up at a much lower temperature, and then that carbon actually moves around, and those iron particles move around, and that carbon all of a sudden ends up fitting a little bit better in that spot it's in. And then, you know, you throw alloys into that mix. A lot of people, you know, when thinking about the difference between blue steel and white steel, and why would you choose blue steel? Well, it's not really for the carpenter's benefit, the alloy. It's for the maker's benefit, because blue steel, oddly enough, is way easier to heat treat than white. And a blacksmith can hire, you know, an apprentice and give him blue steel, and he will make a functional tool. Whereas if white steel takes more effort, it takes more time, it takes more resources to make a functioning tool out of white steel than it takes to make out of blue steel. And you know, alloy steels are, you know, they were really developed for the industry. You know, if they need a spring for a car that doesn't weigh more than this, or they need a spring for a car and they want to dial in how much it springs.
A wrist pin for a piston.
Right. So that the whole white steel, blue steel debate, I think people should drop.
I don't wanna hear it. Not on my property.
The best, you know, the Egyptian used copper chisels. Can you imagine trying to work stone with copper? And that was an amazing tool to them. You know, so that whole thing. Go ahead, you.
Yeah, so
Awesome.
just keeps getting better, but to stay on schedule,
Yeah.
we'll stop here.
Yeah.